Alright, welcome to your pre-lecture video for lecture 11, which will be all about pedigrees and probabilities. So for this pre-lecture video, I'm going to tell you why we do pedigree analyses, besides the fact that they're actually a lot of fun to do and really satisfying. I'm also going to give you a very systematic approach to solving the hardest part of pedigree analysis. And I'll also be giving you a bunch of these useful patterns that you can use as a kind of mental cheat sheet to kind of shortcut your way towards the solutions as well, just to really help you get a head start on solving these. Alright, so as far as why we do pedigree analyses, well, let's go over an example. Let's imagine that some of your relatives in your family have a rare disorder called ichthyosis, and this particular form of it is caused by an autosomal recessive allele. Okay, so we're going to give that a lowercase letter, so lowercase letter I for that mutant allele. Now the good thing is you don't have ichthyosis, so we know for sure that you have one dominant normal allele, which is why you don't have the disorder, but you are worried that you might be a carrier, meaning that you have a normal one, but you also have the disease allele, and you're worried because you don't want to end up giving that allele to your child and having him or her have ichthyosis as well. So how can you figure out your exact genotype? So if you know that you have one good copy but you don't know your other copy, how do you know whether you're homozygous dominant or heterozygous? Well, one way you can do it is to do a test cross, just like we did with our puppy example, right? So when we had Woofy, we didn't know if he's homozygous dominant or heterozygous. We mated him with a homozygous recessive brown puppy and looked at the kids and saw whether or not there's any more brown puppies in the next generation. So in this situation, what you'd have to do is test cross yourself with a bunch of people who have ichthyosis, who are homozygous recessive, and then 9 months later take a look at the results and see what that tells you. Unfortunately, that takes a pretty long time to get enough results to be sure what you have or don't have in terms of your genotype. Also, your spouse might not like the idea of you test crossing yourself with a whole bunch of people. And also, it just kind of defeats the purpose when the whole point was you're trying not to have children with ichthyosis. So test crossing means you're purposely trying to have kids with ichthyosis. So the whole process just doesn't make any sense. Right, another way you could do it is maybe do some genetic testing. Right? So taking a close look at your genes to see if you have the mutant allele. But in order to do that, though, we have to actually know a lot about the disease already. We need to know, kind of, for example, where, on which chromosome and where on that chromosome that gene is located, or we need to know the exact sequence of the mutant allele so that when we look at your DNA sequence, we know what we're looking for. We know what's actually the mutant allele. Right? So we can't do this for everything. Even if we do know all this information, we can do the testing. It costs quite a bit of time and money to do this. So you have to take a blood sample, send it off for sequencing, and it can cost quite a bit of money. Like, for example, for just some simple prenatal testing, it costs like $650 because it's not covered. All right, so not the fastest or cheapest option. Right? So what I would suggest in this situation instead is to just look at your family pedigree, meaning kind of your family history. All right, so this is great in that it's totally inexpensive. You can do it on your own for free, pretty much. It's very fast. You don't have to wait for results. It's effective, and it's also quite a lot of fun. It's a very satisfying problem to solve, like way better than Sudoku in my point of view. All right, so also with pedigrees, you can study brand new disorders. So you find that somebody has some disorder that turns them like Smurf blue. You can start studying it right away, even before we know what genes are causing it, or genes are causing it. It's also useful when your doctors are trying to diagnose some ailment that you have, right? For example, if you watch House or if you go to the doctor, quite often they'll ask you, oh, do you have a family history of breast cancer, colorectal cancer, that kind of stuff, just so they can narrow down what's the possibility that, this genetic kind of predisposition to cancer might be what's ailing you. All right, so obviously if you're in the hospital with some ailment, right, you can't wait 9 months to do a bunch of test crosses to see what you might have. All right. Okay, so now that we know why we're doing this, let's look at kind of how we can use these family pedigrees for our course. All right, so one of the things we'll do is we'll pretend that we have a bunch of new genetic disorders and we'll use these pedigrees to study them to learn how they're inherited, right? So in order to use the pedigree to predict chances of passing it on to your kids, that kind of thing, we need to first know how it's inherited. Right? So for example, we need to ask ourselves questions like, is it a dominant disorder? So for example, does the large A, the dominant allele, cause a disorder so that the small a, the recessive, is normal? Or is it the other way around, right? So is big A the normal allele and small a the disorder allele? So we have to figure out which of those two it is. We also have to find out if the gene is on the Y chromosome, on the X chromosome, or on an autosome, right? That's a very important thing too before we know how to fill out and use a pedigree. All right, so I'm going to teach you how to answer these questions in this video. And then afterwards, in our lectures, I'm going to show you how to use the pedigree once we know this information. So how to fill out the genotypes of the important individuals in the family, and then we can use the genotypes we know to calculate the probability of something happening in the future, for example. All right? Okay, so this problem solving, we'll practice this a lot during lecture. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share with you my very systematic approach to answering those first couple of questions. All right, now originally what I was planning on doing was just using the video to teach you just the basic symbols and the basic rules, and then in lecture I was going to let you kind of figure out your own strategies for solving the problems and answering those questions. I wanted you to do that because it's a really fun and satisfying mental exercise to kind of find your own strategies. But because your midterm is approaching quickly, you don't really have time to learn from your mistakes, and there are mistakes that will happen because sometimes the strategies will work for certain questions, but you try it on a different pedigree and it just will give you a different result, right? So you don't have time to have that kind of trial and error. So instead, what I did was I took a few hours to write down like kind of like a foolproof step-by-step approach that you can follow, and then I'll teach it to you in this video, and basically in lecture, instead of figuring out your own strategy, you can just practice using the strategy I gave you. Okay, so you can practice in lecture, practice with the practice questions afterwards as well. Okay, so this video is a little bit longer, but I mean it's your cheat sheet. It saves you a lot of work and heartache later on. All right, now along with this approach, I'll be also giving you certain patterns. Okay, because to follow this approach, you're going to need to recognize patterns in the pedigree that will help you to reject certain kinds of inheritance, so you can narrow down the possibilities. All right. Now the problem is a lot of these patterns that you might want to use, like for example, you know that X-linked disorders, you see it in males more often. You learned that last lecture, but you can't actually use that in a pedigree because that won't always work. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you exactly which patterns you can use, the patterns that will always work. All right. And also teach you the logic behind why it works, so that you can use it to solve these problems on the pedigree level. All right. Now, if you understand the logic behind these patterns, you don't actually have, oh, and also if you really like solving puzzles like I do, like if you like Sudoku and whatnot, you don't actually have to memorize all the patterns. There's 8 patterns. Like, you don't have to memorize all of them because you can kind of figure it out for yourself just from the pedigree itself, right? So just use your logic and practice it so you can do it very quickly. All right, but if you don't like puzzles, what you can also do is just memorize all 8 patterns, okay, so you know what you're looking for, right? You can basically turn it into a mental cheat sheet. Notice I said mental cheat sheet. Don't actually bring a cheat sheet into the exam, or I will have to call you in my office and fill out forms, and it's very bad. Okay, so one tip though is if you can kind of do a bit of both, like memorize the patterns but also understand how they work, then that's actually the best thing, because that way you can work really fast, and also if you know the logic, you won't accidentally misuse the pattern, okay? So you know the logic behind it. All right, so let's get right into it then. So, first, let's figure out the symbols that you need to understand to actually read a pedigree. Okay, so some of these might vary depending on like which system people are using, what pedigree you're looking at, but these are kind of the most basic things. So anytime you see a circle in a pedigree, that's a female, right? You can think about females having more rounded features, whereas males have more kind of jagged features, so we're the squares, all right? If you shade in the circle of the square, that means that that person has the mutant or the disordered phenotype, okay, that unusual phenotype, whatever we're focusing on. If it's not shaded in, if it's just kind of white or clear like this, then that means that that person is normal or wild type, okay? Now, when you have a horizontal line joining 2 people, that means that these are 2 parents that are mating, and when you follow that line in the middle down to whatever individuals are connected to, those are the offspring made by those parents in that mating. Okay, they don't have to, they're not twins, these are just, you know, siblings born one after another, okay? Now, when you look at the person joined horizontally to those offspring then, like these people aren't actually related to these parents, they're kind of like the in-laws, they're the people that married into the family, okay? And it's important to be able to recognize those people that came from outside the family when we talk about some more complex problems in lecture, all right? All right, so in terms of genotypes, when we're writing them down on the pedigree later on, for autosomal genes, you know this notation very well. So you always put a slash between the 2 alleles, but if you're homozygous dominant, it's big A slash big A small a. For heterozygous, homozygous recessive looks like that. Just one more you need to learn is this, okay? So if you know for sure that the person has a big A allele, but you don't know what the other one is. So if the person could be either big A, or big A, small a, then you put big A and then a little underlined blank, meaning that we don't know yet for that one. Okay, so you only fill it in when you know for sure what they have. All right, the similar kind of deal goes for X-linked, except remember for X-linked genes, we always put kind of the sex chromosomes that individual has. So these are all females, right? But they could have two big B's, a big B and a small b, or two small B's, right? These all, if you know for sure what they are, you can write those down. But if you don't know for sure what the second allele is, again, you can just put a little blank, right? Just to show that you know it's a big B, but you don't know if the second one's big or small, all right? For an X-linked gene, you also have males, so if it's a male with a big B, it looks like that, small b, it looks like that. Remember, for the Y, you put nothing because it's an X-linked gene. There's no copy of that gene on the Y. All right, for Y-linked genes, again, you want to write down, since it's a sex-linked gene, we're looking at sex chromosomes, you always write down what the sex chromosomes are. So a female would have X and X, but we don't put anything up here because it's a Y-linked gene. There's no copy of it on the X chromosome. So any female would just be XX, nothing going on there. If the person has the wild type normal allele on the Y chromosome, one way to show that would just be to put a little plus, say, okay, this Y is totally normal. Or if it's a mutant one, you put a little minus, okay? Now, at Y-linked genes, because they're hemizygous, they only have one copy, there's no such thing as dominant or recessive, so kind of going wild type versus not wild type is kind of an easy way to go. All right. One last thing, so if you're trying to refer to specific people on this pedigree, one of the ways you can do it, if they named generations here and individuals this way, is just put the number like this. So we're talking about generation 2 here, and person number 2 here. All right. Other trees might go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in which case just name the number. Okay. All right, let's get to our approach then. So for step 1 of this approach, we need to figure out, is this disorder caused by a dominant or a recessive allele? All right. So what you do for this step is you try to disprove each of these possibilities, okay? And you do it in the order that I gave it to you, all right? So first try to disprove the idea that it might be a dominant disorder, and then if you fail to do that, then try to disprove that it might be a recessive disorder, all right? And I'll show you how to do that. So focus on the dominant disorder first, trying to make it a case that it cannot be true, okay? So we can do that using pattern 1, okay? So if you find pattern 1 in the tree in any place, right, then you can be sure that it's not a dominant disorder, all right? So pattern 1 is this. If you can find 2 normal parents that have an offspring that has the disorder, okay? For example, right here, you see 2 normal parents, because it's not shaded in, and at least one of the offspring has the disorder, then you found pattern 1 and you've disproven dominant inheritance, so you can move on. Okay, but let's talk about the logic behind it. So why does this actually work? What does this pattern mean? Well, if this was actually a dominant disorder, right? So big A would cause the disorder, small a makes you normal. That means that both of these parents have to be small a, right? The only way you can be normal is if you have 2 copies of the recessive normal allele, right? So if that's the case, then how did this person get the disorder down here then? How did person number 3 down here get a dominant disorder allele when neither of the parents have it? Right? So since that's an impossible situation, then we can reject this original assumption. We know that for sure this can't be true. It's not a dominant disorder. All right? So if you find pattern 1 anywhere in the tree at all, then you know it must be a recessive disorder. You rejected dominant, must be the other one, must be recessive. Okay? So from there you can just label your alleles. It's always a good idea to write somewhere near your tree, big A is the normal one, small a is the disorder one, just so you don't lose track of what's what. Okay, once you've done that, just move on to step 2, you're done in step 1. Okay, that's if you find pattern 1. Now, if you don't find pattern 1 anywhere in the tree, then try to find pattern 2. Okay, so try to disprove the recessive one. All right, so pattern 2 disproves the recessive inheritance, meaning that if you can find pattern 2 anywhere in the tree, then you know it's not a recessive disorder, it must be dominant. All right, so pattern 2 is when you find 2 parents who have the disorder and they have a kid who is normal, who is wild type. Okay. For example, in this family here, okay? So notice 2 disordered parents, 1 normal kid, okay? They're very different from both parents. So the logic behind it is kind of similar to the first pattern, except it's backwards, okay? So if this was a recessive disorder, okay, so if it's actually a recessive disorder, then again, both parents must be homozygous recessive, okay? In order to have the disorder and it's recessive, you need 2 copies of the recessive allele. Then we look at that kid who is normal and we say, okay, well, he must have a dominant normal allele. Where the heck did it come from if the parents don't have one? Okay, so again, this is an impossible situation in this tree, therefore we know for sure that it's not caused by a recessive disorder. Okay. So if you find pattern 2 anywhere in your tree, then you know it must be a dominant disorder since you rejected recessive, all right? And you can just label your alleles. You can know for sure that, okay, it must be the dominant one that causes the disorder, and then it's recessive that's normal, which is why it kind of was hiding in the parents. It showed up later on, all right? So if you can find pattern 2, you've proven that this is true here, you can move on to step 2, okay? Now, in the situation where you can't find pattern 1 and you can't find pattern 2, all right, and that does happen, then you have a tougher decision to make. Then you have to look even more closely at the family pedigree, but I will teach that to you in lecture. Okay, so we'll take that harder step in lecture. All right, so step 2, all right, you've proven, hopefully, that it's either dominant or recessive, or you use the additional steps to prove whether it's most likely dominant or recessive. Now what? Okay, now you need to find out where the gene is. Is it on the Y chromosome, X chromosome, or is it an autosomal gene? Okay, so again, try to conclusively disprove each of these possibilities from left to right. So Y-linked first. Okay, so patterns 3 and 4, okay, which I'll give to you in this one slide, is going to help you disprove Y-linked inheritance. Okay, so let's start with pattern 3. So for pattern 3, if you can find any female who has the disorder, then you've disproven Y-linked. Okay. So for example, person number 2 over there is female because she's a circle, and she has the disorder because she's shaded in. Therefore, we've found pattern 3 is not Y-linked. Okay, so why is that? Well, remember, females don't have Y chromosomes, right? So so if a female here, right, generation 2, person number 2, she's female, she has 2 X chromosomes, and she somehow still has a disorder, then that gene must not be on the Y chromosome. Okay, so that's one piece of evidence you can use to disprove Y linkage. Okay, pattern 4 is if you find any disordered male, right? So you find all the males that have shaded in, all the shaded in squares, and see if the father is normal. Okay, if the father is normal, then you found pattern 4, or see if his son is normal. Okay, anytime you find a disordered male with either a normal father or a normal son, then you found pattern 4. Okay, so we find it here. Okay, we have a disordered male here, okay, with a normal father. All right, and that won't be possible with Y-linked. Okay, so let's talk about how. Okay, so Y-linked genes are hemizygous, so that means that as long as you have one copy of the Y that's messed up, that's the only copy you have, so you'll show the phenotype. So you can always see what the males have, right? What's also important about the Y chromosome is that the father will always give his Y chromosome to all of his sons, right? And that means that for all the sons, their only Y chromosome must have come from dad. Okay? So, since this person has a disorder, that means that his Y chromosome must be mutated, right? And that Y chromosome must have come from dad. So dad should have a mutated Y chromosome as well. Okay? But wait a minute, that dad is not disordered. Okay? So that can't be possible, right? You can't have disorder down here but didn't get it from the dad. All right, so since it's not possible with Y linkage, then we've disproven Y linkage. Okay, so if you find pattern 3 or pattern 4, you've disproven Y linkage. You can cross it off the list. But whether you find pattern 3 or 4 or not, so if say you don't find pattern 3 or 4, or you do, still move on to try to cross off X linkage. You have to cross off 2 of these to prove one of them. Okay, so to disprove X linkage, we actually have 4 different patterns we need to look for, and those are the last 4. Okay, so if you found during step 1 that this is a recessive disorder, okay, so big B is normal, small b is the disorder, okay, then you'll look for patterns 5 and 6. Okay, so when you're looking at X-linked, whether it's dominant or recessive matters, so figure out step 1 first, and then decide which ones you're looking for. So if it's recessive, look for patterns 5 and 6. So pattern 5. So pattern 5 and 6, they both help you disprove X-linked recessive inheritance. Okay, we're looking at X-linked genes that are recessive disorders. Okay. So for pattern 5, what you need to do is you need to find a disordered female who has a normal son. Okay, for example, right here, we have female who has the disorder but has a normal son. So we found pattern 5. Okay, so why does that disprove X-linked inheritance? Well, let's take a look at it. So sons always get their X from their dad, and their Y from the dad and the X from the mom. Okay, so any X chromosome that this son has must have come from mom. All right. So if this mom here, so generation 1, person number 2, she has the disorder, so she must have 2 copies of the recessive disorder allele. Okay, so that means that when she has a son, she must give one of those to the son, right? So if the son has to have just one bad copy of the allele, then he should really be disordered as well. But since he's normal, right, then the situation doesn't make sense, right? This can't be an X-linked gene if mom didn't give a bad copy to the son and make him disordered right away. Okay, so that's pattern 5. Pattern 6 is kind of the opposite. So you need to find a normal male that has a disordered daughter. Okay, so we see that right here. We have a normal father having a daughter who has a disorder. Okay, and that's not possible if it's X-linked. Okay, so let's look at why. So fathers will give the X chromosome to the daughter and the Y chromosome to the sons. Okay, so since the father always gives the X chromosome to the daughter, right, and this guy's normal, that means he has a big B normal allele, well, that means that he's for sure going to give that X to all of his daughters, right? So if this daughter has a big B normal allele, a dominant normal allele, she should be normal as well, right? But she has a disorder, so that tells us that, okay, something's wrong here. This pattern doesn't make any sense for X-linked, therefore this must not be an X-linked gene. Okay. All right. So that was for recessive disorders, trying to disprove X-linked. Now let's look at dominant disorders. Okay, this time big B is the disorder, small b is normal. Okay, so go through a little more quickly now. So if you know it's dominant disorder, you're looking at patterns 7 and 8, right? And these are used to disprove an X-linked inheritance of a dominant allele. Okay, dominant disorder. All right, so for pattern 7, you need to find a normal female who has a disordered son. Okay, so we find one right here. Normal female, disordered son. All right. So the reason why this is not possible for X-linked is the son always gets an X chromosome from mom. Okay, so if mom has 2 copies of the recessive normal allele and then gives that to the son, and that's the only copy he has, then he should be normal, right? There's no reason why he should actually have the disorder. So since he has the disorder, then we know the gene is not X-linked. This pattern would not be possible. Okay, that's pattern 7. Pattern 8, you're looking for a disordered male who has a normal daughter. Okay, so we see that again in the same family as well. So we have a male with a disorder having a normal daughter, right? And the reason why that's not possible is the fathers always give the X chromosome to their daughters, okay? And this father has a bad copy, has a dominant disorder allele, right? And he has to give that X to his daughter, right? So if the daughter has at least one dominant good copy of the allele, then so one dominant bad copy of the allele, then she should have the disorder just like dad, right? Dad gave her one dominant bad copy, she should have the dominant disorder, right? But since she doesn't, since she's totally normal, then we know that it can't be X-linked. Okay? So to interpret your results from step 2, okay, having looked for all these patterns for Y and X-linked, one of the things you can do is this. So if you manage to disprove Y linkage by finding one of patterns 3 or 4, and you also disproved X linkage by finding one of these patterns, right? Then you know for sure that it's autosomal, right? If it can't be Y and it can't be X, then it must be autosomal. It's the only last possibility. Now there's one small exception to that that's quite unusual, but I'll tell you about that in lecture, okay? Now, let's say that you weren't able to disprove Y-linked or X-linked, that one of these you just couldn't find the pattern, so you don't know anything for sure, right? In that case, again, you have a more difficult decision to make, but I'll walk you through that in lecture as well. Okay, but this first situation will happen enough that you'll be able to use what you've learned already to solve a lot of the problems. Okay, so what do you do now? So first, practice using this approach. So practice it before lecture if you can, just to get a head start. You can practice it using your practice questions, or if you want more practice, just go on to Google Images, search for the word pedigree, and you'll get just thousands of practice ones that you can do. Okay, so do it until you know it well, and you can do it quickly for the midterm. All right. So when you get to lecture, we're going to do some progressively harder questions where we kind of do this analysis and also use the tree as well. And you'll learn to use the trees in a very logical and hopefully efficient way for your midterm. Okay, that's it for now. Sorry for the longer video, but please watch it, learn this well, write out a cheat sheet to learn from and use in class if you like. I will see you in class. Thank you very much. Bye.